There is a document sitting inside a sealed file at Kensington Palace that Charles was never supposed to see the way he saw it, handed to him not by his wife, not by her staff, but by his own son, in a room with no one else present, with the relevant passages already marked. It was found during a routine internal audit that nobody inside the palace had flagged as sensitive, which is the only reason it was ever found at all. And when Charles finished reading the marked sections, sources close to that meeting say he set the file down on the table in front of him, said nothing for a long time, and then asked to be left alone. 3 words from the future King of England to clear a room. And the reason those 3 words were necessary is what this entire story is about. Let me take you back to where this actually begins, because the beginning is not dramatic, and that is precisely why it worked for as long as it did. In the spring of 2025, the palace undertook what is described in institutional language as a standard governance review. That is the kind of phrase that makes people's eyes slide off the page, which is the whole point of it. Governance reviews happen on a cycle. They are procedural. They exist to check that documentation across the various royal households is consistent, current, and properly authorized. Nobody goes into one expecting to find anything. The staff assigned to them are competent and careful and almost universally underpaid, and they spend weeks going through filing systems that have not been properly rationalized in years. The review was triggered by something completely unrelated to Camilla. It was triggered by a discrepancy in the Duchy of Cornwall accounts, a minor administrative inconsistency that William's office flagged in February, and that required cross-referencing against a broader set of household documents to resolve. That cross-referencing is what opened the door, because when the auditors began pulling documentation from the wider palace administrative system, they found a category of file that had been accessed, amended, and in certain cases supplemented in ways that did not correspond to any authorized instruction they could locate. The files in question were succession instruments and associated ceremonial authority documents. And I need you to hold that phrase because it is going to carry the weight of everything that follows. These are not letters. They are not correspondence. They are not the kind of internal memo that gets written and filed and quietly forgotten. Succession instruments are the formal legal and constitutional documents that govern what happens to royal authority during periods of transition, incapacity, or ceremonial transfer. They determine who holds what power, under what circumstances, and in what order. They are, in the most precise possible sense, the architecture of the monarchy itself, and somebody had been inside them. Before we go any further into what was actually found, you need to understand what it means for an unauthorized hand to touch those documents, because a lot of the coverage around this has reached for words like scandal and crisis, without stopping to explain why those words actually apply here. The British monarchy operates on a framework that is part statute, part convention, and part document so old that the legal weight they carry has never been formally tested in a modern court, because no modern court has ever had to test it. The Regency Acts, the letters patent issued by the sovereign, the instruments that govern the councillors of state, the documentation around the order of precedence at ceremonial occasions, all of it sits in a web of formal authority that requires the sovereign's explicit sanction at every point of amendment. What that means in practice is this. If a document in that category is altered, supplemented, or reinterpreted in a way that has not been directly authorized by the king, it is not a paperwork problem. It is a constitutional one. It does not matter how small the change appears on the surface. It does not matter whether the person making the change believed they were acting in good faith or within the spirit of some earlier conversation or informal understanding. The authority required to touch those documents is specific, it is formal, and it is the king's alone. Full stop. Now, sit with the fact that the audit found amendments that corresponded to no royal authorization on record, not a missing memo, not a conversation that was authorized verbally and simply not written down. Nothing. The changes existed, the authorization did not. And when investigators began working backwards through the access logs to establish who had been inside those files and when, the picture that assembled itself was not random, and it was not the result of administrative confusion. It had a shape, and the shape pointed in one direction. To understand how this was even possible, you need to understand what Camilla actually became inside that institution after the coronation in May of 2023. Because the public version of Camilla, the rehabilitated queen consort who charmed the country into tolerating her over 20 years, is a real thing, and I am not dismissing it. But it is not the whole picture. Inside those walls, the coronation was not just a ceremony, it was a transfer of operational standing. Before it, Camilla had influence. After it, she had access. There is a difference, and it matters enormously in a place that runs on proximity to power. In the 18 months after the coronation, Camilla's household expanded. Staff she had worked with for years moved into more senior positions across the broader palace structure. Advisors who reported formally to the king's household began, in practice, running significant portions of their work through channels that connected to her office. Not because anyone authorized that formally, because that is how institutions work when someone with the sovereign's complete personal trust begins to occupy the space around him. Charles's health became the accelerant. From February 2024, when the cancer diagnosis was made public, the king's working capacity contracted. Engagements reduced. There were days when he was simply not available, and into every space that his absence created, the household had to put somebody. Not William, who has his own household and his own institutional standing, and who was not going to be absorbed into Buckingham Palace's administrative machine, no matter how much of the load he was quietly absorbing. Somebody closer, somebody already inside the building, somebody whose access to the king's paperwork and the king's schedule was intimate enough that the distinction between her office and his began to blur in ways that nobody sat down and decided on, but that everyone inside the building felt. Royal insiders who spoke to journalists through the summer of 2025 described an atmosphere in which Camilla's staff had developed what one source called an operational confidence that exceeded their formal mandate. That is the careful language people use when they work in institutions and cannot afford to be quoted directly. Translated into plain English, it means they were doing things they were not authorized to do because nobody had told them to stop. Now, add access to the document filing systems. Add a period of reduced royal oversight. Add staff who had grown accustomed to acting on what they understood to be the queen consort's preferences without waiting for formal instruction. And you have the conditions in which something like this becomes possible without anyone in that office necessarily understanding the constitutional weight of what they were touching. Whether Camilla understood, it is a different question, and it is the question that is sitting at the center of everything. Let me tell you what the investigation actually found, because this is the part that has been circulating in fragments and rumor, and I want to lay it out the way the auditors laid it out, which is in sequence, in order of severity, the smallest thing, and the thing that made Charles ask to be left alone. The first category of amendment was procedural. Language in certain ceremonial authority documents that governed the order of precedence at state occasions had been supplemented with additional clauses. Clauses that elevated the queen consort's independent ceremonial standing during any period in which the sovereign was not personally present. On the surface, that sounds administrative. In practice, what it means is that during any state occasion where Charles was absent due to illness, the amended documents would have placed Camilla in a position of ceremonial authority that was not legally hers to occupy. Not as regent, which is a formal constitutional status with its own statutes and its own requirements. Simply as a person whose name appeared in documents that had been quietly rewritten to expand her standing. The second category was more specific. Documentation relating to the counselors of state, the small group of senior royals who can carry out certain official functions on the sovereign's behalf during incapacity, had been annotated. The annotations concerned the circumstances under which the queen consort could be consulted on matters being handled by the counselors. Consulted is not a legally trivial word in that context. Consultation creates a paper trail. A paper trail creates precedent. And precedent, in constitutional terms, is one of the most powerful forces in British public life because it does not require legislation to function. It simply requires that something happened once and was recorded. And then there is the third category, the one that cleared the room. Among the supplemented documents, investigators found material relating to the post-accession period, the period after Charles dies and William becomes king. Specifically, documentation that touched on the arrangements governing Camilla's position, residence rights, and access to institutional resources during the transition. The amendments were subtle. They were written in the language of the institution, which is formal and precise, and designed to be read by people who understand how these things work. And what they did, in the assessment of the constitutional lawyers brought in to review them, was attempt to lock in protections for Camilla's post-accession, standing in ways that went beyond anything Charles had formally authorized, and that would have required William, as the incoming sovereign, to actively and formally unpick them, rather than simply allowing them to lapse. In other words, somebody had tried to use the machinery of the current reign to constrain the next one, and they had done it quietly, in the language of administration, in documents that a routine audit had almost missed entirely. Charles was told on a Wednesday morning, not by his private secretary, which would have been the formal route, not by a household official, which would have been the managed route. He was told by William, which tells you everything about how the sequence of events had unfolded in the days before that meeting. William came to Buckingham Palace. He brought a physical folder, printed documents, the same methodology he used in the September 2025 meeting over the yacht scandal. There is something deliberate in that habit. He could send documents electronically. He has a private secretary whose entire function includes managing exactly this kind of sensitive communication. He prints them, he carries them, and he puts them on the table himself. Because a physical folder in a room cannot be unread, cannot be deferred to a later briefing, and cannot be managed by an intermediary into something softer than it actually is. He set the folder on the table. He walked his father through the three categories in the order I have just described to you: the procedural amendments and the post-accession material. He did not editorialize. He did not frame it. He presented the documentation the way a man presents something he wants a room to see clearly, without the interference of his own anger. Sources close to that meeting have described Charles's reaction in the same terms across multiple accounts. He was quiet. He asked specific questions about the access logs, the dates, and the authorization trail. He read certain sections of the documents twice, and when William reached the material relating to the post-accession period, Charles stopped him. He asked one question. He asked whether Camilla had been shown the contents of those documents before they were amended. The question is devastating in its precision because of what it is really asking. It is not asking whether she knew, it is asking whether she directed it. And those are not the same thing, and Charles understood the difference completely, and he asked the question anyway. William told him that the investigation had not yet established that with certainty. Charles nodded. He asked to be left alone, and the folders stayed on the table. Now here is what you need to understand about the sequence of events before that Wednesday morning. Because William did not find out about this from Charles. He found out before Charles did, and that fact, on its own, is one of the most significant things in this entire story. The information came to Kensington Palace before it went anywhere else. One of the auditors involved in the governance review, a person with enough institutional experience to understand exactly what they were looking at when the access logs began to resolve into a pattern, made a decision about where to send it first. Not up the formal chain inside the king's household, to William's office. Think about what that decision means. It means somebody with access to sensitive palace documentation, someone who works within the formal structure of the institution, looked at what the audit had uncovered and concluded that the appropriate first recipient was not the king. It was the future king. That is not a small thing. That is a person inside those walls making a quiet, private judgment about where power actually lives, about whose office could be trusted to handle this correctly, about which set of hands was safest. And they sent it to Kensington. William's team spent 72 hours going through the documentation before he went to his father. 72 hours of constitutional lawyers, of cross-referencing access logs, of building the kind of factual case that cannot be dismissed as misinterpretation or administrative confusion. He wanted to be certain before he walked into that room. Because you do not walk into a room with the King of England and tell him his wife has been making unauthorized changes to succession documents without being completely, irreversibly certain of every single thing on every single page. And he was. By the time he carried that folder through the doors of Buckingham Palace, there was nothing in it that could be explained away. He had checked. His team had checked. The lawyers had checked. The documentation was what it was. What the source's decision to go to Kensington first tells you, though, is something the lawyers cannot quantify. It tells you that the informal repositioning of loyalty inside that institution, the quiet realignment of staff around the center of gravity they believe is coming, had already progressed far enough that a person with sensitive information about the Queen Consort trusted William's office more than the king's own household to receive it cleanly. That is the part of this story that does not make the formal reports, and it is the part that is going to define the next decade of that institution. By the time the investigation's findings were being reviewed by constitutional lawyers inside the palace, 3 external bodies had been quietly notified. I am not going to dress that up or soften the language around it. When constitutional lawyers are brought into a palace matter and external bodies are notified, you are no longer inside the category of internal family dispute or administrative irregularity. You are inside the category of constitutional incident. And that category has a specific weight in British public life that the Palace Press Office cannot manage away with careful wording. The bodies notified were the Privy Council Office, the Cabinet Office, and a senior figure within the Lord Chancellor's department. None of those notifications have been made public. None of them were announced, briefed to correspondence, or acknowledged in any official communication. The Palace's position, to the extent that it has a position, is that internal governance matters are handled internally, which is the sentence an institution uses when it wants to say nothing while appearing to say something. But here is the thing about notifying those 3 bodies specifically. The Privy Council is the formal constitutional mechanism through which royal instruments are given legal effect. The Cabinet Office sits at the center of the relationship between the sovereign and the elected government. And the Lord Chancellor's department is where questions about the legal validity of formal instruments go when those questions cannot be resolved internally. You do not notify those 3 bodies about an administrative paperwork problem. You notify them about something that touches the legal architecture of the state. And the internal legal assessment that was shared with those bodies contains, according to 2 sources with direct knowledge of its contents, one word that the palace will never allow into a public statement. That word is unauthorized, not irregular, not inconsistent, not a matter requiring clarification. Unauthorized. That word, in a formal legal assessment about succession documents, is the constitutional equivalent of a fire alarm in a building where everyone has been trained to walk calmly to the exits. It does not mean the building has burned down. It means the building is on fire. And the question of how the fire started and who was in the room when it began is now a matter for people outside the family to examine. The government's involvement is being handled with the discretion that anything involving the monarchy and constitutional law receives. Ministers are not commenting. Officials are not backgrounding journalists. The formal machinery is moving slowly and carefully, and in the particular silence that British institutions maintain when they are dealing with something they do not yet know how to name in public. But it is moving, and it does not stop. Princess Anne was shown the file on a Tuesday. She read it in the presence of 1 aide and 1 legal advisor. She did not read it quickly. She went through each section in the order it was presented. The procedural amendments first, the counselors of state annotation second, the post-accession material last. She asked 2 questions during the reading, both of them technical, both of them about the specific authorization requirements for the categories of document involved. The legal advisor answered them. Anne nodded both times and went back to reading. When she finished, she put the file down flat on the table. She did not push it away. She did not close it. She set it down the way you set something down when you want the room to understand. You have read every word of it, and you are not done thinking about it yet. And then she said something, not loudly, not with the particular precision she uses when she wants a sentence to be remembered. Something quieter than that. The kind of thing that gets said when a person has been holding a thought for a very long time and has simply run out of reasons to keep holding it. She said that she had always known this was the kind of woman Camilla was. And then she said that the difference between what she had done to Diana and what she had now done to Charles was that Diana had seen it coming and said so, and no one had listened. She said Charles had not seen it coming at all. That sentence has been moving through the household since the Tuesday she said it. Not in a press release, not in a statement. In the way things move in that family, which is from one trusted person to another. Carried in the memory rather than on paper. Arriving in rooms where it lands differently depending on who is sitting in them. Anne has spent 50 years in that institution saying almost nothing in public and everything in private. And the sentence she put down on that table on a Tuesday afternoon is doing the work that 50 years of silence never quite managed, because it does not leave room for the alternative interpretation. It does not have a diplomatic version. It is simply the view of the woman who knows that household better than anyone alive, stated plainly in a room with a file on the table, and left there for whoever comes into that room next to sit with. Camilla still holds her title. She is still queen consort. She still sits beside Charles at the occasions where sitting beside Charles is what the diary requires of her. The external shape of her position has not changed in any way that a photographer standing outside Buckingham Palace would be able to capture, and she is the loneliest she has ever been inside those walls. Because the one thing that has protected Camilla since 1997, through the years of public hatred, through the years of being called the Rottweiler and the other woman, and everything the British press was able to construct out of the wreckage of a marriage she helped destroy, was Charles, his certainty. His willingness to absorb the damage on her behalf, his refusal to stop defending her no matter what the cost to his own reputation, or his relationship with his sons, or his standing with the public. That certainty is gone, not because he stopped loving her. I am not going to tell you Charles stopped loving Camilla. He has spent 30 years proving the depth of that commitment, and one audit is not going to undo the wiring of a man that old. But love and trust are not the same thing. And the question he asked William in that room, the one about whether she had been shown those documents before they were amended, is not a question a man asks when his trust is intact. She knows what he asked. In a household this small and this intimately connected, she knows. And she knows that he received an answer of, "We are not yet certain," rather than an answer of no. And she knows what "we are not yet certain" means in the mouth of a man who has just spent an hour reading a legal file about unauthorized changes to succession documents bearing her staff's fingerprints. The access has changed, not dramatically, not in the way that makes it into a formal statement or a diary adjustment anyone could point at. In the way that access always changes in that building when something has shifted at the top, conversations that include her, briefings that land on her desk, the daily rhythms of institutional information that tell a person inside a palace whether they are still inside the room where decisions are made, or whether they are beginning to be outside it. She is beginning to be outside it. And unlike every previous time she has faced difficulty inside those walls, Charles is not pulling her back in. There is something sitting underneath all of this that has not been said clearly enough in any of the coverage, and I want to say it plainly. Charles is ill. He has been ill since February 2024. He has been managing a cancer diagnosis while running a monarchy, while trying to hold together a family that has spent a generation fracturing along every available fault line. And he has done it with the particular discipline of a man who was trained from birth to put the institution above everything, including his own body. The investigation has now placed in front of him a specific and devastating realization. The period of his greatest vulnerability, the months after the diagnosis, when his capacity contracted and his oversight reduced, and the people around him were absorbing the administrative load he could not carry, was the period in which those amendments were made. Somebody used the gap his illness created. I am not telling you Camilla sat down and calculated that. I am not inside her mind, and neither is anyone else reading a file of audit documents. What I am telling you is that the timeline maps onto his illness with a precision that the investigators noted and that Charles has been shown. The access logs begin in April 2024, 2 months after the diagnosis. They continue through the summer and into the autumn. They correspond to the periods of reduced royal oversight documented in the household records. They stop in January 2025, around the time William's office began the cross-referencing work that would eventually pull the thread. What that timeline does to a man who is already managing fear about his own mortality, already facing the knowledge that his ability to protect the people he loves is finite and contracting, already watching his son quietly absorbing the institutional gravity that used to belong to him. I do not think there is a word for that specific kind of injury. Sources close to Charles describe him as shattered, not angry in the way that produces action, not cold in the way that produces distance, but shattered in the way that happens to a person when the floor underneath the thing they were most certain of gives way without warning. He built his life around this woman. He paid every price the institution and the public asked him to pay for the choice of loving her. He made her queen. And in the months when he was most afraid and most reduced and most in need of the ground underneath him holding, somebody in her orbit was inside his succession documents, Whether she directed it or permitted it, or simply failed to ask what her staff were doing with access they should not have had, is the question the investigation has not yet answered. But Charles is sitting with all three possibilities, and none of them leave him anywhere comfortable. Here is where this ends up. Not where it ends, because this is not finished, and anyone who tells you it is finished is not paying attention. But where it has arrived, which is a place that has no clean resolution and no press release that fixes it. William is going to be king. That has always been true, and it is more true now than it has ever been, because the institutional weight that used to sit entirely with Charles has been migrating toward Kensington for over a year. Slowly at first, and then with an acceleration that the yacht scandal began and this investigation has completed. The staff who make their quiet private bets on where the future lives have made them. The auditor who knew where to send the file had already made theirs. When Charles dies, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager. She keeps the title, she keeps a residence. She loses the institutional machinery that has sustained her position because that machinery runs on Charles being sovereign, and once he is not, it belongs to William. And William now has a sealed file at Kensington Palace that documents unauthorized amendments to succession instruments bearing the fingerprints of her household. He did not go looking for it. It came to him. He handled it correctly by the institutional book, exactly the way you would expect from a man who has spent years proving that he operates on documentation rather than personal grievance. But it exists, and it will always exist. And when the question of what protections and resources and institutional standing Camilla receives after Charles is gone lands on William's desk, as it will, as it must, he will be answering it as a man who has read that file, every page of it, twice. The monarchy William is building has a specific shape. Fewer people, tighter controls, zero tolerance for informal arrangements that accumulate power without formal authorization. He proved that with Andrew. He proved it with Harry. He proved it with the yacht. And now the investigation has handed him documentation that puts Camilla in the same category as every other person in that institution who mistook proximity to the crown for authority over it. There is an internal memo sitting in the sealed file at Kensington Palace. 5 words. It is the legal team's summary assessment of the post-accession amendments, the ones designed to constrain what William could do once he became king. The ones that were going to require him to actively unpick them rather than simply letting them lapse. The 5 words are, without authority, without effect, void. That is 3 words. But the 2 that come before them, the 2 that open the memo and establish the legal standing of everything that follows, are the ones nobody outside that building is supposed to know. The 2 words are, Prince William. The memo is addressed to him. Not to the king's private secretary. Not to the Constitutional Review Team, not to any of the formal bodies that were quietly notified in the weeks after the audit findings were confirmed. To William. Because by the time those 5 words were written, everyone inside that building who understood what the file contained had already accepted something that has not yet been said out loud in any official capacity. The man this institution belongs to is already in the room. Diana understood what Camilla was doing to the people around her. She wrote it down. She gave it to a lawyer, and the institution she wrote it about spent 25 years deciding she had been wrong. William has spent his entire adult life watching that institution make that decision. He has never once said publicly that he disagreed with it. He has shaken hands and stood in photographs and attended the coronation and kept his face completely still in the way he learned at 15, walking behind a coffin down the mall while the world took pictures of him doing it. He is 30 years older now. He has a sealed file and a legal memo, and the loyalty of staff who decided before anyone asked them to that his office was the right place to send the things that matter. Camilla spent 30 years winning. Every room she wanted, every wall she rearranged, every portrait she had put in the dark, every advantage she accumulated in the quiet spaces that institutions create for people who know how to move through them without leaving fingerprints. She left fingerprints. And the one person in that building she was never able to make forget whose son he has found them.